Okay.
Well, welcome everybody. My name's Lynn Julius. I represent Harif, and tonight we're having the second in our series of lockdown lectures. The subject of tonight's talk is Tales of Jewish Sudan, Back to My Roots. Now, usually at Harif, we aim to raise awareness of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa by having lectures and talks and cinema screenings, but of course that's not possible at the moment. So this is the online alternative. It's very exciting because we have people from all over the world, and it's a new departure for us, and we hope you enjoy this lecture. I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. It's Daisy Aboudi, whose grandparents and great-grandparents lived in the Sudan. But of course, they were kicked out of there. She recently went back to the Sudan for 6 days, and this is why this talk is going to be particularly exciting, because I'm sure she has many stories to tell. I'd also like to mention that Daisy is very active in Sephardi Voices, which is an oral history project, very worthwhile, interviewing Jews who were born in Arab countries, who can share their experiences. Before handing over to Daisy, I would just like to ask Lawrence to say a few words about how the practicalities of this meeting and how to ask Daisy questions.
Right. Hi everyone. The first thing is tonight's meeting is being recorded, so if anyone wants to hear a copy after the event, they can. Because we have about 100 people on the call, for questions, if you look on your control screen, you've got a chat button. If you put any questions on that chat button, then in the Q&A session, Lynn will pick up the questions and ask them direct to Daisy. With 100 people trying to unmute and mute people, it's sort of an organizational impossibility. There's also in participants, if you've got any questions, you can raise your hand under the participants thing, and I will be watching that if people raise their hand, but the preference will be if you've got questions, you raise it in the chat section. We're trying to record it live on Facebook, but Facebook's being a bit awkward tonight after having rehearsed it a few times and given a few people great laughs. I'll now hand it over to Daisy.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, fantastic. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you. Oh no. No, I don't need to share it like this. I'm sorry. It's not working.
The share screen button should work.
There we go. Right, I'm hoping you can see that. I'm going to just assume that you can. Great. Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Lynn, for hosting me. Just a little bit about Tales of Jewish Sudan. I started in 2005 when I started recording audio interviews with members of the Jewish community. And since then, I've interviewed over 70 members of the community from Sudan. It was at its peak, the community was at its peak from 1945 to 1955, and there were about 250 Jewish families at its peak at that time. It's quite a small community, which makes it quite unique in Middle Eastern Jewry, because this allowed Jews from all over the Middle East to mix, marry, they shared food, and because it was such a small community, they also integrated and took on aspects of the larger Sudanese society. which is especially obvious in the food culture. All my grandparents were born or brought up in Sudan, and I grew up with a very romanticized version of what Sudan was. I had bedtime stories of childhood in Sudan full of very exotic things like dust storms and Niles that were in two colors, and it all seemed very romantic and far away and distant. And it was only when I grew up and I studied history at university and I tried to do a little bit more research into what this community was actually like, and I found there was next to nothing. There's one book and a few internet articles, and that was it. So I decided to begin documenting it myself, and perhaps naively thought it would be a 6-month project, and 5 years later, I'm still here. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about the history of the community. Sudan came under Ottoman rule in 1820, and it was under Egyptian governorship. The rule was characterized by harsh taxes, Arabization, and the suppression of northern Sudanese tribes especially. The Egyptian Ottomans, led by Muhammad Ali Pasha, who you can see on your screen, allowed an influx of European missionaries into Sudan, and it was part of an attempt to squash a thriving slave trade. People know of General Charles Gordon of Khartoum, and he was appointed the Governor General of Sudan by the Egyptian administration. We don't really know how many Jews were in Sudan in this early period. There is evidence that there were a small number of Jewish merchants in El Obeid and Durman, but there's very, very scant evidence. What there is very hard to access, and all we really have to go on is oral testimony. As happens to all empires, it eventually met its match with the Mahdi, the self-styled Mahdi, calling himself, it means a savior. The Mahdi was a religious and political radical, and he was wildly popular at the time, and he's still really quite popular in Sudan now. In 1885, he succeeded in taking over Khartoum and became the independent ruler of Sudan. But as soon as he did that, he died of typhoid, and for the next 13 years, Sudan was ruled by the Khalifa, or his successor. That's what Khalifa means. One of the laws put in place by this new regime was to convert all non-Muslims living in Sudan had to convert to Islam and take Muslim wives. This was predominantly aimed at the missionaries that I mentioned previously, but the Jews living in the country got caught up in this law, and these converts became known as Masalma. When the British arrived in 1898, they recorded 36 Jews who declared themselves as Masalma, as converts, and these Jews returned to Judaism. The rest decided to remain Muslim, which again makes it difficult to know numbers because we don't know how many that rest were. We do know a few of the families, but obviously we don't know all of them. The most famous of these Masalma, these converts, was a man named Moshe ben Sion Koshti. And he changed his name to Musa Basuni when he converted, and he stayed with his new name even after he returned to Judaism. He was a very successful merchant in Durman under the Khalifa, and when British rule was established, he immediately set about establishing a formal Jewish community in Sudan. He converted a room in his house into a synagogue, and with the help of the Egyptian Bet Din, which is the Jewish court of law, he arranged for the arrival of Rabbi Solomon Malka. Rabbi Malka had been born in Morocco, and he trained as a rabbi in Tiberias. And he arrived in Sudan in 1906, and his first job, if you like, was to convert all the wives and the children of the Masalma who had obviously been born as Muslim, and he converted them to Judaism. And he arranged for a Torah scroll to be brought to Sudan. He was also a shochet, trained in Jewish ritual slaughter for kosher meat. And he intended to stay in Sudan for 2 years and then return to Tiberias, but he ended up staying for 40. And he died there in 1949. And you can see him on his screen with some of his children and his grandchildren. Just so that you can see a map of Sudan and kind of get your bearings a little bit at this stage. As the British Army entered Sudan, it built a railway. It was predominantly for its baggage and for transport of the army itself. However, this meant that the country was now much better connected and accessible. And you can see the railway line that they built is this one from Wadi Halfa down to Durman and then across to El Obeid. Because the country was now so much more accessible, Jewish merchants from all over the Middle East saw an opportunity for new business and arrived via Egypt. They predominantly settled in the 3 towns of Khartoum, Durman, and Wad Medni. And they were originally traveling merchants of silks, other textiles, and gum arabic. And then they settled and established small shops and businesses. While the earliest arrivals settled in Durman, by the 1920s, Khartoum had become the new fashionable place to be. And so from about 1925, Khartoum became the center of Jewish life. And while some remained in Durman, a lot of the Jewish community moved to Khartoum. The community remained under the Egyptian Bet Din, the law courts, and they were traditional, but they weren't overly observant. Don't forget, they had come for business. They weren't religious settlers or settling there for religious reasons in any way. For example, they would attend synagogue on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath, but they might drive there, which is not strictly allowed in Orthodox Jewish law. The biggest festivals were Purim, which was one of the things that you do on Purim is dress up, so they would have a huge party. We also give tradition, like gifts of food that would be passed around the community, and there's stories of people baking huge trays of biscuits to be shared round on Purim, and they would go round to each house. Each woman would bake a tray that would go round from house to house to house to house, and eventually you'd get your own tray back as a gift to yourself. Then the synagogue was built in 1926. It was big enough to house the whole community. On your screen, you can see a picture of in the center of the synagogue. And the major festivals of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and Pesach, Passover, were very strictly adhered to. You can see on your screen a quote from one of my interviewees about fasting on Yom Kippur. There's another story that as it was so hot during the service, it came near the end of the Yom Kippur service, that a woman from the balcony at the top decided that she'd just had enough and started screaming down at the rabbi to hurry everything up, and then fainted. Which, Rabbi Malka died in 1949, and he was so popular and so well loved, the synagogue was renamed after him. And it took 7 years and 2 false replacements until Rabbi Elbaz joined the community from Egypt, and he stayed in Sudan until 1964. You can see him on your screen as well. Boys in Sudan attended almost exclusively a school called Komboni College in Khartoum. It was a private boys' school run by Italian priests, Italian missionary priests, and the girls attended its sister school, which was called the Catholic Sister School, or Unity High School, which was a British school run by Jesuits. All the schools followed a British curriculum, and they all taught in English. Some students learned Arabic as well, and some spoke French at home, but mostly people spoke Arabic at home and English at school, or English at home, some people, but the vast majority spoke Arabic, Sudanese Arabic at home. There's stories of children laughing at their grandparents for having funny Iraqi accents, for example. Whilst some boys and even fewer girls did go to university, most didn't. You can see a picture of the University of Medicine's classroom at the top of your screen there. And the girls either worked in typically secretarial roles for a short period of time before they got married, or they got married immediately after leaving school. Boys either joined their father's businesses or their father's shops, or they entered employment in British companies in Sudan, for example, working at Barclays Bank. Those that did go to university predominantly studied medicine. There was a couple of engineers and one economist, but it was generally to study medicine. In 1946, the community built a club. We're talking about the Jewish community at this time, but there were several clubs in Sudan. There were several communities in Sudan, Italian, Greek, Armenian, Syrian, and almost all had a club where they could get together and socialize. The teenagers of each club would get together, play sports against each other. So you can see the Jewish club basketball team on your screen. I'm told that they lost quite regularly. The Greeks were much better. And every year the clubs would come together and throw a ball, a party, a winter ball, and you would go around, buy tickets, and each club would visit each other. You would go to all of them, and it was quite a big competition who would have the best party that year. And it was a chance to see and be seen and fundraise as well for your community. I'm often asked whether the Jewish community integrated with the Sudanese population. And the answer is really, it depends on the family, and it depends on the wealth of the family. Some were fully integrated. They were friends with their Sudanese neighbors in all ways, shapes and forms. They ate together, they shared feasts together. Others were tried or sought only to socialize with other Jews or other European, as they called them, communities. But it is certain that nearly none, or almost actually all of them, didn't socialize with the British because they were seen as very snobbish, and they didn't want any of the other communities socializing with them in their club. In 1948, Israel was founded, and almost immediately the poorest members of the community decided to move to this new country and try and seek their fortunes there. Sudan gained its independence in 1956, in January 1956 on New Year's Eve. And in October of that year, Britain, France, and Israel went to war with Egypt over the Suez Canal. This exacerbated anti-Semitic sentiments in the general population and marked the first wave of Jewish emigration from Sudan. Those who were in employment and who didn't have businesses or property in Sudan were the first to leave, and they generally left to Israel or the USA. In 1958, the General Aboud, who was a military leader, General Aboud, who was a military leader, led a military coup against the government. Sorry. And established a military dictatorship in Sudan. In this period, anti-Semitism began to grow. Whilst personal occurrences of anti-Semitic attacks were rare, the wider sentiment in the country was becoming increasingly hostile. The papers called for retribution against Zionist spies. There was one Jewish business that was falsely accused of poisoning meat supplies to the hospital, and it turned out actually their competitors had been poisoning the meat so that they would lose their contract. And there was one person told me there was a general idea that the Jews were bad, but on a personal level, people would tell you you're a good Jew. So there was this idea of this uncomfortableness in the air. Although there weren't really physical attacks or anything like that at this time. In 1964, this military dictatorship was overthrown and a civilian government was restored. But this government moved Sudan closer to Egypt. Nasser had come to power in Egypt, and this new government moved Sudan closer to Nasser. And anti-Semitism at this time further increased. And from 1964 onwards, for the next 3 years, the majority of Jews left Sudan. In 1967, jumping 3 years now, the Arab League summit was held in Khartoum, and shortly afterwards, a 6-day war between Israel and many Arab nations broke out. As you can imagine, with the declarations that led to the war happening in Khartoum, the mood became extremely hostile. All young Jewish men without the connections to prevent it were rounded up and arrested without charge. The media and graffiti all over the city called for the death to the Jews. And as soon as the war ended, almost all of the Jews living in Khartoum left Sudan for good. They were the people who stayed for the longest were the people who had the most to lose. At this time, it was quite hard to get an exit visa. So they would pack up as if going for holiday and then just never return. Often leaving, as you can see on the screen, everything behind. Those that did stay in Sudan at this time, a few were living in Khartoum, but the majority of the Jews who did stay were living in Wad Medani, which was away from the political hotbed of the capital. And this small group of Jews, there weren't even enough to make a minyan at this time. A minyan is a quorum of 10 men for certain prayers. But those that did stay stayed until 1973, when Palestinian activists captured and murdered several foreign diplomats in Khartoum. And this was the last event that made the rest of the Jews in Sudan leave, along with a lot of the Italian and Greek and other communities at the time. In 1986, the synagogue building was sold and it was turned into a bank, and that building has subsequently been demolished. A lot of colonial buildings or buildings from the colonial time have subsequently been destroyed in Sudan. So the building that the club was in is also destroyed, and there's aren't really any of those buildings left. Until very recently, it was virtually impossible for Jews to visit Sudan. The country had been under a military dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, which was virulently anti-Israel, anti-American, and highly strictly Islamic. But in 2018, he was overthrown in a revolution, and in September 2019, a mixed military-civilian government was established in Sudan. I'm drastically oversimplifying for time, but that's the overview. The new government, in an effort to improve Sudan's international relations, made a public appeal for Jews to return to Sudan. And I saw this as a unique opportunity to go back to a country that I'd heard so much about, that I'd studied for the last 5 years, and where my family came from. So in January, my brother and I went to visit, despite the hesitancy of some members of my family. So this is the cemetery in Khartoum as it was in January. The cemetery was, in 1977, there was a move that some of the graves were airlifted. There was a deal, some of the graves were airlifted and taken to Jerusalem in Israel, but a lot of them were not. There were still a lot of graves in Khartoum, and a lot of remains are still there. The cemetery, believe it or not, is now in a better condition than it used to be. It was used as a dumping ground for spare car parks, and as you're walking, you're actually walking on broken windshields for some of it. This is actually one of the better pictures, the least distressing pictures. There have been efforts to clear it up in the last 3 years, and that did go well. Now there is an actual locking gate, so it can't be trashed any further. And yeah, there have been efforts to clear it up. What was quite interesting, though, is that when we asked to go to the Jewish cemetery, everyone knew exactly where, well, the guide knew exactly what we were talking about. People in the street knew exactly what we were talking about. You can see quite a lot. It's right near a market, so you can see people just around the edges who are looking very curiously at these two people who had come to wander around the very obviously Jewish cemetery. My paternal family lived in Umdurman, and we got the opportunity to go to the market where my family had a shop. My grandfather had a shop, and we explored the Jewish quarter, which is called the Masalma quarter, so the Jewish people lived there. This is the middle picture is me and a growing collection of locals who we would ask one person, do you know where the Jewish quarter was? And they would say, oh, I think so, it was by the soap factory. This person might know. And then they took me to another person, and they took us to another person, who took us to another person, who eventually took us to a building that they said was the old Basuni house. So I decided that that was probably as close as we were going to get, which was good enough for me because we were definitely in the Jewish quarter, and this is a picture of it. It's still known, as I said, as the Jewish area, and it's quite run down now. A lot of the buildings are empty, and we were told that they were full of squatters, a lot of the buildings. Aside from that, we saw the schools. We saw from the outside Comboni College and the sister school, which are both still standing. And the Comboni College is still a well-regarded school in Sudan today. We saw the Grand Hotel. I didn't put pictures of all of this because it's not that easy to take pictures in Sudan in the street, especially as a tourist. We were quite obviously the only tourists there. Everyone else who was traveling as a tourist was there for another reason. So either for diplomatic purposes or business, or a lot of archaeologists were there as well. So we did kind of stick out a little bit as much as we tried. But it was lovely to be able to see the places in the pictures that I have, and to see where we were going, and see all of that. We were always with a guide. We didn't say that we were Jewish publicly. Our guide did know we were Jewish, and the people in our hotel knew we were Jewish, but we didn't really spread it beyond that. Although the news of 2 tourists wandering around looking for Jewish areas and the Jewish cemetery maybe gave the game away. And one day our guide said to us, "Oh, my friend heard that there are 2 Jews here, and they wish that we could have invited them for tea." So that was kind of nice to hear. There was an air of hope in the air, which was really nice. We weren't able to visit Wad Medani, just due to time constraints. But both me and my brother did say that we would love to go back. I think that's it. I think I'm going to take questions. I can see some of them. Shall I just go through them, Lynn? I can't hit Lynn.
Just go through them.
Okay, I'm just going to go through them.
What have you done, darling?
Was the Alliance Israel active in Sudan or only? No, they weren't in Sudan. There was no formal Jewish education in Sudan. And Alliance Israelite Universelle were not in Sudan. It was completely English education. The exam board came from Oxford University in England, and it was very much a British education. Comboni College even had English names for the houses: House of York, House of Lancaster. Where was the club? Was in Khartoum.
Lincoln asked the questions now.
Oh, so yeah,
It's all right. I think I'm happy for Daisy to carry on.
Okay.
Answering questions.
Yeah, where was the club located? It was located in Khartoum. Was there anti-Semitism in Sudan before the 6-Day War? Yeah, the thing is that the Jews of Sudan were never forced out. So there was never a decree to expel them or anything like that happened in other Arab countries. But yes, there was anti-Semitism, although it was probably more subversive. It wasn't so on the surface before the 6-Day War. You wouldn't have to hide that you were Jewish, but you would never, ever, ever mention the word Israel. Did any Sudanese Jews migrate to the Gondor region over the border in Ethiopia? No. Some moved to, after they left, they moved to other countries in Africa, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Aden as well. Not Aden, sorry. Eritrea. But no, the story of the Ethiopian Jews going through Sudan is not linked to this community. Where did the Jewish population reside? So I'm going to go back to. Can I see the questions? I don't know.
Yeah, because they showed the screen.
So if you look on the screen here, you can see the 3 towns. This is from just a Google Maps view. So there's Khartoum North, and Durman. They predominantly lived there, and then there are the bridges across. The cemetery is kind of here. Do I know the families that lived in Durman? Yeah, but I'm not comfortable saying names on this public forum, unfortunately, sorry. Where the cemetery is, I just answered that. Regarding Muhammad Ali Pasha, I missed what you said about his role in the Sudanese slave trade. I was under the impression that under his dynasty, slavery picked up until the British came in and controlled it. Is this correct or incorrect? I'm not an expert on the Ottoman Empire, so I don't want to say anything wrong, but he did try to suppress the slave trade, and I understand he didn't manage. But bringing in Charles Gordon and the missionaries was an attempt to squash it, but it was very, very unsuccessful until the British came in. Did Jews arrive in Sudan from Iraq? Some did. They came from all over the Middle East. So there were Jews from Syria, from Egypt, there were some from Turkey, even some from Greece, and some from Iraq as well. Can I return to screen? Yeah, I can stop sharing my screen.
Daisy, I've got a question for you, and that
Yes.
is the people who were actually arrested in 1967.
Yeah.
How long were they in jail for?
Only for the duration of the war.
Right. So it wasn't like in Egypt where
No.
some of the prisoners stayed in jail for up to 3 years. And
No, it wasn't. It was, they were just rounded up, and then as soon as the war ended, they were released. It was different. I think the Jews in Sudan, and I do really want to say this, that I'm not a spokesperson for the Jews in Sudan, and everyone who left had a reason for doing so, different reasons for doing so. But it was generally, they could see what had happened in Egypt, which was scary. The mood was changing, and as more and more Jews left, it was almost like a self-fulfilling cycle that there were no more Jews left to marry. So as you were growing up, you would hit a certain age where there would actually be no one left there, so you would also leave. So that it kind of snowballed from there. But there were these flashpoints of 1956, 1964, 1967, where things got dangerous or got more difficult, and then they left in waves on those 3 years.
And what happened to their property? Did they leave all their property behind?
Yes.
Did they manage to sell anything?
No, I think the ones who left earlier managed to sell a little bit, but generally their property was all left behind. Yeah, so on a lot of occasions, they would give their property or their houses to their neighbors or their Sudanese business partners, with the expectation that it would be sold and then the money would be sent to them once they'd left. But that never happened on any occasion that I know of.
Very good. Can you say something about the current government's attitude towards the Jews? I mean, I think I came across the news that they wanted Jews to return to Sudan. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they put out a statement that said that they wanted the Jews to return to Sudan, which is why I felt comfortable going, really. I don't think anyone's going to be moving back to Sudan, but I do think that the community would love to be able to get to a point like Egypt where they could go back on a holiday and see it. I think that they would like to get to that point. That would probably be the ideal. But whether people will be moving back, no, I don't think so. They're all old, like they've built their whole lives here now. One person said to me, I've got a British passport, why would I need to go back? So it's quite difficult. I don't think, to uproot your life again when you're already got grandchildren living in a country, I don't think that's going to happen.
Lots of questions.
Oh, I've got lots of questions here. Wait, I need to go. I'm just going to scroll.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there elements of culture in common with Sudani Arabs that have been conserved in the diaspora, for example, cuisine? And I've got another question about food. Was the food tradition taken from the country of origin of each family? Are there any dishes which are unique to Sudanese Jews? So I'll answer those together. I think one of the things about the Jewish community in Sudan was, as I said at the beginning, because it was so small, and because they couldn't afford, so in other countries, Syrian Jews would marry Syrian Jews and Iraqi Jews would marry Iraqi Jews and Egyptian Jews would marry Egyptian Jews. And Sudan was too small for that. So you would have Iraqi Jews marrying Egyptian Jews, for example. So the food culture was much more connected in that way. You would have a bigger mix. So I grew up eating dishes that would be traditionally Iraqi and Egyptian, and Syrian, all mixed in together. If you have some families who had Italian heritage and they'd be eating Italian dishes mixed in with their Iraqi dishes. So in that way, it is quite unique. And then, yeah, they did take on Sudanese food as well. The Sudanese okra is very popular in Sudan. So a lot of dishes that involve okra we eat as well, which are very Sudanese, like mullah, for example, is like pounded dried okra, which is very, very Sudanese. The bread, it's kisra, it's similar to Ethiopian bread, like a flat sorghum bread, which the Jews of Sudan would also eat. So yeah, the food culture did kind of get absorbed in, and that definitely happened. If I'm not answering the questions thoroughly enough, then just keep asking me. There was a TV program in Sudan with a family. Their grandparents were Jews, as they said they converted, but kept the history, and they tell a lot about it. They were proud of their history, despite the difficulties they faced. Yeah, there are the descendants of the Jews who stayed Muslim are still living in Sudan, and they are still practicing Muslims. They are proud of the fact they are practicing Muslims, but they also don't hide their Jewish heritage. They know, I mean, one of them has a surname Israel, so they can't really hide the fact that they have Jewish heritage. And they're well known in Sudan, and yes, but they are very much practicing Muslims. I think, have I answered them all? Can you see any more, Lynn? Oh. So the animosity, one question is, the animosity between Jewish Sudanese and other Sudanese was therefore more political than hostility to Judaism. That's quite a difficult question. There's quite a lot in that, because it kind of links into the whole of the Arab world, and also to a small extent Britain today. This idea that you can have a good Jew or a bad Jew, and you can say, well, it was political in terms of it was linked to Israel or Zionism in some way. But if you're accusing all of the Jews in the country of being Zionist spies when none of them are, then is that a political problem, or is that an anti-Semitic religious problem? So I think it's very interlinked. You can't really say it was a problem just with politics, but it was not a problem with religion. On one level, yes, because the people themselves would say, oh, I've not got a problem with Jews on a religious level, but actually it goes a lot deeper than that. And if you can't really separate it in that way. So yes, there is a political element to it, but it's also anti-Semitism, just under a different banner.
Right, are there any more questions?
Oh, was I scared?
When you were there.
When I was in Sudan, was I scared? I was nervous. Before I got there, I was nervous. My family were very, very scared, I would say. Once I got there, I wasn't. When we were there, there was actually a small attempt to. There was some excitement, as they say. But no, once you're there, I think things are not as scary. The only place that felt slightly hostile and we felt slightly on edge was the cemetery, because it was such an obviously Jewish thing to be Jewish area. We were obviously Jews being there, and it was a market, and it was also a rougher part of town, quite literally on the other side of the rail tracks. So there was probably the only place that we kind of felt a little bit on edge. I was there with my brother, but not really. And we had a guide with us all the time. We were never alone just wandering the streets. So we took all the precautions that we needed. I think I was just excited. I was really excited. Like when I saw the Umdurman Bridge for the first time, I was really, really excited.
Daisy, can I come in here? It's Lawrence.
Yes.
I wonder, do we have anyone on the call whose family comes from Sudan,
Yes.
or is from Sudan, who would like to share some family experiences?
So
with us?
that's
just
actually what I was just about.
Then open up your line.
Yeah. So I was just about to say that. Can I unmute people? Or
I can unmute people. So if people say in the chat room they want to speak,
yes,
then I'll unmute them.
Okay. There are lots of Jewish Sudanese people online, and I would love to hear from them because, like I say, I'm not their spokesperson, and they all have very different opinions of everything. If they want to say anything, no pressure. While
anyone, if you just either raise your hand or go in the chat room, I will bring you up. I'm still waiting for the first person.
Don't be shy.
Say that, Andrea.
Andrea?
Yeah, Andrea.
So it's Andrea you want to bring in, okay?
Yeah.
Andrea, I'm unmuting you now. You're unmuted.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Daisy. Such a pleasure to meet you. So my mother was born there, and Daisy probably knows more about the history of my family than I do. I was actually born in California, and the stories, the small stories, my mother was the fifth of 7 children who were born there. And the way I know the story is that my parents, my grandparents were from Egypt, from Alexandria. My grandfather actually was born in Turkey, but probably came to Alexandria very young. And because of, I think because of commerce, they went down, my grandfather was an accountant, went down to Sudan, and actually my grandparents were married in Sudan. I think we have a copy of their ketubah. And then in 1935, Daisy, you probably know the history better than I do, but in 1935 they left. And I don't know if it's because the French maybe they became independent at that point and they were very nervous. And from that point, they went to Israel. At the time, they went to Palestine. And all I know is that my grandfather went ahead and my grandmother, bless her heart and soul, took 7 children who were under the age of 14, I think by train and by boat to Palestine.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Next person I'm going to unmute is Shushu. Okay, Shushu, you're unmuted.
Just a moment.
Hi, Shushu.
Oh, he's still muted.
I've unmuted him.
Shusha, can you unmute yourself? Oh, almost. If you unmute yourself, there we go.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to add that my grandfather was David Farag Shua, and he helped the Rebbe Shlomo Malka in the religion part of the synagogue. He helped the people there to learn Hebrew, and he used to teach by the sons of the people there how to read Hebrew. Then in 1946 he came to Israel. This is to add to Shlomo Malka because he was his assistant. He used to assist him. And another thing is you have to add to the people that came abroad to Sudan. My grandfather, he came from Austria. And he met my grandmother there, and they got married. So you got another nation to add to the United Nations that came to Sudan.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. So I'll add a little bit to that, if you don't mind. This is typical of this small Sudanese community. Farag Shua is my grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, great-great-grandfather is Farag Shua. The school was actually opposite the synagogue. So Comboni College, the boys' school, was opposite the synagogue directly. So during religious studies, each stream of religion, so the Muslim, the Christian, and the Jewish kids would all be sent to their own religious leaders to learn. And Farag Shua was the one who's taught Hebrew until he went to Israel in his very old age. He was apparently quite a terrifying man. Yeah, and the other thing about, there were Ashkenazi Jews who came from via Egypt, but also just before the Second World War, there was a small influx of people escaping the Holocaust who settled in Sudan as well. Lynn, can we go to Robert Kramer?
Yes, it's unmuted and waiting for you.
Lovely.
Hello. Hi, Daisy.
Hi.
It's nice to see you. And thank you for doing this, first of all, and for being the person who's brought all of this information and all these people together. I think your efforts for the last 5 years or so have been tremendous. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm a professor of Middle East history for everyone else, and I've studied the history of the Jews of the Sudan for the last 35 years. I think one thing that's important to say is that when we look at the history of Jewish communities in the Arab world, the so-called Eastern or Mizrahi Jewish communities, it's important not to impose on that history a more recent narrative, which unfortunately happens. One tends to look at the history of Jewish people as being sort of homogeneous, and obviously the experiences of Jews in Europe, the Ashkenazi community, is really in no ways comparable to the histories of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. The Jews who were in Sudan, coming as early as the 1870s, came from a variety of places. And they had really complex relations with the Sudanese people they settled amongst. They were very successful merchants. They married within themselves until the Mahdiya, as Daisy pointed out. But during the Mahdiya, they virtually all took Sudanese wives. They were obliged to do so. And even after the Mahdiya and after the British conquest, some of them did remain Muslim, and for the ones who didn't and reverted to Judaism, they still maintained very close links with the Sudanese community, so much so that the actual elites of Mahdist society became very close social friends with these former Muslim, now once again Jewish Sudanese people. A lot of these families were biracial, maintained and to this day, of course, are biracial because of having intermarried with Sudanese women. I heard stories when I lived in Sudan in the 80s of Jews and Muslims fasting together on Ramadan and Yom Kippur. That's a level of, I don't know, it's more than cooperation that would, belie any accusation of the kind of anti-Semitism that existed in Europe. I mean, there were very close ties. The Jewish Social Club was a place that a lot of Sudanese would go to. And the Jews, the Greeks, the Italians, the Armenians, and the Syrian Catholics all maintained clubs and would go to each other's clubs along with the Sudanese. It was a really interesting mixed community for about 40 years or so. And when things got bad, of course, they got bad for a variety of political reasons. But again, I guess the only caution I would make is that resist the temptation to sort of see or superimpose upon this history something that happens later as if it's kind of inevitable. Because, again, from about the 1870s right up until 1948, there were really complex and sometimes incredibly close, affectionate relationships and intermarriages. Again, people fasting together, praying together, celebrating together. They attended one another's children's circumcision ceremonies, bar mitzvahs, weddings, funerals. The Miss Sudan pageant, there was a Jewish woman who was, I think, the first or second Miss Sudan. I mean, this was a really incredibly interesting mixed community. And again, thank you, Daisy, very much for pulling this together.
Okay, we've got Janine Tamam wants to speak next.
It's not Janine, it's Jack Taman. She's my daughter. Hello, Daisy, how are you? Okay, Daisy, were you aware that I was told, rather, a couple of Jews went back to the Sudan for some time, and they were giving back their businesses. They sold it and returned back to their country. Were you aware of that? That's what I was told. Can you hear me? Oh, you cannot hear me.
Okay, right, now I'm muted. Sorry, I was just temporarily muted, so I couldn't reply.
Okay.
The question was whether they got their properties back.
Yes, they got their businesses back. They sold it and returned again.
And
So,
returned to Sudan. This is being recorded for the internet, so I'm not going to comment on that, if you don't
Okay,
mind,
fair
for now.
okay. All right, because my brother was given permission to return to the Sudan officially from the government to start a business there and return backward and forward from Florida to the Sudan. And unfortunately, he wasn't very well. Just about before he wanted to leave, within the month, he passed away. But he was given actually the visa and the approval and the seal of approval from the government directly. I saw the permission, so I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and I'm not the first Jew who's gone back to Sudan. I'm not going to pretend that I'm the first. I'm not. It was just first from my family that had gone back.
Yeah, I just want to say you are doing a brilliant job, and we
Thank you
very much for everything you brought back. My children are watching now, and they're interested very much in my history.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I can't see any other questions.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask Jack, when was his brother given the visa to return? Was it by this current government?
Oh. The last government.
The last government?
Yeah,
So they were already trying to encourage the Jews to return under Bashir?
It was, I think, more like individual business licenses rather than a thing of a Jewish thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. I think there was one gentleman there.
We've got no more people.
Ruth Finkel. Is that a buy or is that asking for question? I'm not sure. Asking question, Ruth Finkel.
Right. Okay. Oh, Shushu's got another question as well.
Okay, just a minute.
Da, da, da.
Yeah, no, Limor Swade.
Right, and I think you wanted to.
Yeah,
I
Let him talk. Limor.
Who's that
Yeah,
guy?
because he's unmuted.
Who's that? No.
Do you have a question?
hi, Juki.
I can't see Ruth Finkel.
I'm also unmuted. What I wondered, Daisy, was these Jews that had converted to Islam, did they retain any Judaic customs like the Jews in Spain did? You know, we hear stories of the Jews who were forced to convert in Spain, who would always put a white cloth on the table on Shabbat or light the candles in a cupboard. Did these Jews that became Muslims forcibly, did they retain any kind of Judaism in that way?
Yes, and they also retained both wives, their Jewish wife and their new wife. So yes, in that, yes, they did. Yeah.
We have Suad Solomon next. Suad?
Yeah, well, actually, it's been yeah, I have about the intermarriage, which you mentioned that the Jewish men were encouraged or perhaps forced to marry Muslim women. So I wondered about the motive for that. Was it seen as beneficial for the Muslim women through some economic reason, or was it to cut down the Jewish community? And related to this question is what was the situation for the Jewish women? Just as important for us, but you didn't ask about them.
Did you get?
I think so. I'm just going to check that I understood. The question is about intermarriage, marrying Muslims. I think you mean in the Mahdiya period, but there were also love matches and converts throughout the whole period of time of Jews in the Sudan. I gave you all a very, very summarized version of the history just because of time. But like any community.
Oh, you muted her.
Did I mute you? Sorry.
Can you just repeat that last sentence, Daisy? You were muted.
Okay. So there were marriages throughout the whole period of people who converted and married Jews. Like any country in the world that has a Jewish community, people married in and people married out throughout the whole period of time. During the Mahdiya, I think is what you meant by intermarriage. So the families that converted back to Judaism, their Muslim wives converted to Judaism. In the case of Basyuni, his wife Mana converted to Judaism and remained a Jew her whole life. She's buried in the Jewish cemetery and she was a practicing Jew. His first wife, Bechora, lived with them. She didn't have any children, but they lived all together, three of them, until she died. We don't know what she thought about it, but she lived with them and she helped raise the children of the new marriage. So yeah, make of that what you will.
The next question is from Monica Godwin. Monica, you're unmuted.
Okay. I just want to say that actually listening to all this made me very emotional since my father passed away last year. I don't know, can you hear me? Because it's making a noise
Do you
here.
have a phone and a computer on?
Okay, I just have to say that talking about, my father told me so many stories and he said wonderful things about Basyuni, but my father was also, God rest his soul.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional.
Monica.
He was one of the first industrialists in the Sudan, and he spoke so nicely about the Sudanese. And growing up, I was never aware of any anti-Semitism. We had so many dignitaries to our house, And I just remember my father talking very fondly about them all, and there was a great respect between the two communities. Have wonderful memories of the club and everyone there. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? Marlena's made a lot of observations, but I wonder, Marlena, do you want to come and share them to talk through them? Interesting observations.
Marlena. No, Monica.
Marlena and Jack Tamam said something. I think, was that everyone?
I think it's just Marlena.
Marlena, do you want to say them over the phone? I know you've made them on the chat line. If you'd like to talk people through them, I'll unmute you. Okay, you're online, Marlena.
Okay, I'm Monica's sister, actually. So I was born in Sudan, and we had a wonderful life when we lived there. I know my parents had a lot of Sudanese friends, and we often, I remember one Sudanese family having this huge farm in Khartoum North, and we would go and spend the day there. And another very good friend, who was a friend of my family, when we went to their houses, they were really hospitable. I mean, one of the dishes we never took on from the Sudanese was raw lung and liver, which they had with lemon and onion. So the Jews, I know, didn't have that. But there were some incredible Sudanese, and until now, I'm in touch with one person who was very friendly with my mother. And there was one lovely Sudanese man who actually helped us get the exit visa. So of course, towards the end, there was some, maybe with I think my dad used to say that it got really bad after Nasser. When Nasser came to power and he visited Sudan, and there was this pan-Arab, and the Sudanese then joined with the other Arab nations. And another thing, the flag in Sudan used to be blue, yellow, and green for the Blue Nile, the desert, and the fertility of the green. And it was later when they joined the Pan-Arab movement that they changed the flag, and the flag had the black in it, like the Palestinian.
That's fascinating.
So I have wonderful memories of Sudan. We did have to leave in the 60s. We left quite suddenly, we had to leave. But anyway, as you can see, I'm getting quite emotional about it. And I think my dad's family had been there for over 100 years, since the 1800s with Kitchener. My grandfather went down. So it's wonderful that this is all coming up, and it's really also very sad that all these people who left Sudan and who had those wonderful memories for so many years, it's such a pity that a lot of them have passed away.
And I think it's quite a good thing maybe to end on is that you can see how emotional the Jewish community of Sudan get when they think about Sudan, when they talk about Sudan. And it's something I think quite telling that they think of it as Sudanese Jews when the community was actually only there for quite a short, relatively short period of time. And I think that just shows the mark that Sudan left and Sudanese culture left on the community. So this flag that Lawrence is sharing now was actually very, very prevalent in the recent revolution. A lot of the graffiti and they used this old, originally Sudanese flag a lot in the revolutionary imagery in the recent revolution.
So I think if there aren't any more questions or comments, we will end it there. I just wanted to thank Daisy for a most wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for all your hard work.
I'm working on a book, but it's slow going, working at the same time. But I am trying.
I know the feeling. No, thank you for all the stories that you've collected and for all the hard work you're doing. It's very precious work, and I know time is marching on and people are dying off, and you're there to capture their stories, you know, before it's too late. And I want to wish you all the very best in what you're doing at Sephardi Voices. It's very important. So thank you very much indeed for this wonderful presentation. I'd just like to tell everybody that we have more lockdown lectures coming up. We have Michelle Huberman will be talking about her 4 weeks in Morocco during Ramadan, and that's next Wednesday, the 13th. And we're doing that in partnership with Spiro Arc. And I will be giving a Thursday, and there are lectures the following week and the week after that. So please do keep informed. To get details of all the lectures, please subscribe to the Harif website. It's www.harif.org. And we'd love to hear from you. Please do keep in touch. And thank you very much. This is being recorded, hopefully, so you'll be able to see Daisy's presentation or hear it in the future. And thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for hosting this. It's been brilliant.
Bye.
Yes, 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 yes.
Speak normally if you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks.
Daisy, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing this.
Everyone with you.